All right, guys, Mr. Sherwin here. As always, make sure you're studying for your test long before the actual test. We don't want to cram for hours before the test. We want to slowly, every single night, go home and, if possible, do a quick review of what we talked about that day, whether in a lecture or video or assignment or reading or discussion or whatever. So throughout the entire year, if you want to see, what to expect for that unit, if you go into Canvas, you go to modules and you go to APUSH Resources, Review, and Tutoring Help, you'll go to Unit Test Study Guides. And here will be our study guides. Here are all of our study guides. You even had some recordings here that you can listen to later when we get to these sections. Now, I'm actually doing a new recording now for the second unit test, which is from 1607 to 1800. This is the Unit 2 one. So you'll open up that guide. I'm going to put the recording, I'll put this below the Unit 2 as soon as we finished it today. So if you're looking at your study guide, we're going to go over about a third of it now, and we'll do two other videos that will do the other remaining third. So we're going to focus now on sort of the road to the revolution, looking at the French and Indian War, looking at the road to revolution. So obviously we're talking about things we've done in class, the APUSH Explained French and Indian War Guide. We talked about, the road to revolution. It was a lecture note you were supposed to take notes on. So that's where all this information is coming from. So there will be some things in here that I'm going to mention that we didn't really directly mention in class, but you do need to know as well, okay? So the first thing to talk about is sort of dates to know cold, 1754 to 1763. That's the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. 1775 to 1783, that's what we consider the American Revolution. Some historians will disagree. Some historians will say that the road to the American Revolution started way back in 1763 with the end of the French and Indian War. But as far as our concerns, we really need to make sure we focus on 1775 to 1783. So I know I've given you different dates in the past, but I'm telling you right now, for our purposes, let's focus on like the shot heard around the world all the way to the signing of the Treaty of Paris of 1783. Okay, 1789, two major things happen there that you need to know and remember for the end of time. The first thing is that the Constitution is implemented after years of debate and changes, and of course the Articles of Confederation that didn't work. So the Constitution is finally implemented, and also Washington is inaugurated as our first president. Okay, so no competition, no election. He's inaugurated. He's the only president really, outside of a president who is killed and his vice president takes over. He's the only president to not be elected. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, so we're going to go back to New France because we're talking about origins of the French and Indian War. So way back to 1608 when we talk about Samuel de Champlain, who founded Quebec and established New France and established a foothold here in the New World. When we look at reasons for settling New France, the biggest reason, of course, is the fur trade. One of the other reasons we talked about is that the Jesuit priests who were going out and sort of exploring parts of the world and bringing back information to the Catholic Church, the Jesuit priests were sort of helping with settlement and establish, not missionaries like the Spanish did, but establishing a Catholic presence in places like New France. And also, like I said, their big focus was education. So they were like basically thrown to the wind everywhere in the world, and they were sent to go and settle. Okay, De La Salle, we talked about him when we talked about exploration. He's going to claim the Louisiana Territory west of the Mississippi River for France. Marquette and Joliet, they're the ones who are going to travel up and down the Mississippi River, and they're really going to, between those two guys, De La Salle and Marquette and Joliet, they're going to sort of establish the borders of what will become later known as New France. Okay, so on your sheet next, we have the Albany Plan. This was a plan developed by Ben Franklin and a few other colonists at the time, and it was meant to sort of organize the colonies against the French, okay, collect taxes, band together with the Iroquois. It was ultimately rejected, but would become sort of a rough draft for the Declaration of Independence. And again, this is something that we've talked about in class. This propaganda picture that I have on the screen here with the colonist, join or die. This is in reference to the Albany Plan. So back to the study guide. Our next thing to talk about, to make sure you know, is Fort Duquesne. This is really the first first battle of the French and Indian War. We didn't talk about the regiments who went up there to Fort Duquesne. This is all taking place in the Ohio River Valley because of disputed borders between the French and the English. Also, we have incidents between the English on the east and Native Americans who were allies with the French. So Duquesne, what we did talk about when we talked about Fort Duquesne is that the man who led the Virginian detachment up to fight battles up at Fort Duquesne was George Washington. So this is one of the things we talk about later, as far as where does Washington sort of get prestige as a military leader? He gets it from his experience in Fort Duquesne. Also, another event that he was involved with prior to Fort Duquesne was something called the Braddock Expedition. Okay. So when we look at the French and Indian War, again, this is about disputes over boundaries in the Ohio River Valley. That's why Americans sort of get involved. They don't really want to be involved. But really and truly, the big reason that we have a French and Indian War is because England is fighting wars on all fronts all over the globe. Remember, we talked about multiple wars going on in other parts of the world. We have the King William's War and Queen Anne's War and King George's War. And so it's almost like it just takes some time to come to America, but now we have, England fighting the French in America because they're fighting the French elsewhere in the world. Okay. So the Acadians, we didn't really talk about them, but they're an interesting group of people. Just know that, one of the results of the French and Indian Wars is that because of our war with France, we're going to kick out peaceful people who we got along with sort of in the area of Nova Scotia and Maine, and sort of push them out of our territory, even close to our territory. So it's just a sad thing that happens in war, that the guys on the other side get sort of pushed around, and that's what happens to the Acadians. Okay, General Wolfe, we didn't talk about him too much, but we hopefully will get a chance to talk about him when we get to the art unit, if we do get a chance to go over that. General Wolfe was a British commander who died in the Battle of Quebec. Remember that when the French and Indian War first started, things were going very poorly for the British. The Americans who were supposed to be fighting, or the colonists rather, who were supposed to be fighting for the British in their own territory, weren't really motivated that well to do it. They weren't organized. The British weren't really doing a great job in military battles. But one of the positives, I guess, about the death of General Wolfe is that he actually he's painted in a very martyr-like light. And so people see this, and it doesn't really turn the tide of battle, but it does put the British in a positive light for Americans or soon-to-be Americans and other British loyalists. Okay, so William Pitt is sort of the British leader who turns the tide of battle for the British in the French and Indian War, and after he sort of takes over command, we start to see the British win the war. Okay. So that's really the end of the war itself. Not a major war to remember, but the impacts of the war are what matter for us in American history. So the Treaty of Paris, 1763. There's multiple treaties of Paris, so make sure you remember this one's 1763. A couple big impacts, and if you're confused by this, don't be, because land is going to change hands multiple times. Because the second we think Louisiana, we think French, and then we think American. But after the French and Indian War, England is going to gain land east of the Mississippi River. So land that was sort of in that Ohio River Valley. So not all of New France. England is going to get Florida from Spain. So that's going to change hands. And then land that was still part of New France, but still west of the Mississippi River, the land west of the Mississippi River, that's going to go to Spain. So it's going to change hands a little bit. Okay. So those are the impacts as far as the major countries go. Now, as far as Americans go, or soon to be Americans, there are going to be some other results, and we know about these. Okay, so remember, go back to the colonies, the English, the French, and the Spanish. We talk about the characteristics of those colonies. Native Americans had a pretty good relationship with the French. So when the English take over this territory that's east of the Mississippi River that used to be French, now we're going to have problems. Native Americans are going to be very worried about what's going to happen with English encroachment upon their territory. So we're going to have Pontiac's Rebellion, where we have some Iroquois, and I want to say Algonquin. But just know that Native Americans are going to fight back against the British because of the fear of encroachment on their territory. So that's going to be a problem. That's going to cause the British to send out soldiers and fight skirmishes, and it's going to be a pain. Okay, so because of Pontiac's Rebellion and because of just massive debt of the French and Indian War, one of the big results that matters for us in our American history is something called the Proclamation Line of 1763, which is going to forbid any colonists from moving across this imaginary line, which is essentially the Appalachian Mountain Range. And the reasons for that clear. We don't want any skirmishes with Native Americans. We don't want any problems with, that cause the British Army to be sent over there and fight battles. We're already in massive debt. We don't want any more. It's going to cost money for us to protect you. So just don't go across that line. And of course, this is seen as, sort of disrespectful to the colonists who fought in the war, because they were fighting because they wanted access to this territory in the first place. The French didn't have a heavy population to really use it as well as the English wanted to. And now they're sort of forbidden from going over there, even though it is English territory. Okay. So, we're going to have obviously issues of Native American resistance to now English encroachment, even though England is trying to prevent this. So there will be some skirmishes, and there will be, a murder here and there. A white person gets murdered, and of course, how do the English react to that? Well, you've got some stereotypically, drunk Irish immigrants, the Paxton Boys, who feel like their only defense against Native Americans in this new territory is going to be to go out and murder a bunch of innocent Native Americans. So the Paxton Boys have what they call a rebellion, and they go out there and they kill 20 innocent people who happen to be Native American, who they thought were scalping people and such. So obviously now we have even more reason or the British have more reason to keep Americans out of this territory. Okay. So remember, salutary neglect. This is essentially what England had been doing for the colonies, basically allowing them to sort of create their own laws and govern themselves and establish their own economies and all these different things. And all of that ends after the French and Indian War. And the Proclamation Line of 1763 is just the start of this idea of salutary neglect ending. And the colonists finally get it. And now England is going to have a heavy hand in governing the colonies to keep them out of trouble, because the British point of view is that if the colonists move westward, it's going to cause problems and debt. And the American point of view is that, we were left alone for a century, and now you're going to tell us how we're supposed to live. So this is just the start of many problems for the Americans, or soon to be Americans. So one of the other things we talked about in the lecture was the Privy Council. This was something that was set up back in England. And what the Privy Council did was it basically kind of counteracted any colonial laws that were against the king's and parliament's laws. So we have some problems with colonial laws being sort of null and void now because of this Privy Council. That's going to cause some stress. Okay. Something else, Benjamin Franklin was part of this. He was the head of the Board of Trade for Pennsylvania. These were government officials who were nominated back in England. Each colony had its own official, and it just made trade more difficult, because each colony had its own sort of leader of this Board of Trade. And what we're going to see, these are just slight agitations, but these are things that are going to cause the colonists sort of rage, because they were left alone for so long, and now they have to follow all these different rules, and you've got bureaucracy involved and all these kind of things. Okay. Mercantilism, remember, this was the idea even during salutary neglect, that the colonies only exist to provide and benefit the mother country. And that's going to continue, but it was almost, kind of in the background during salutary neglect, but now it's very much direct, that the colonies are going to be forced to understand that your job is to support the mother country. You're not going to just go out and do your own thing and make money yourself. So again, heavy-handed government control by Britain. Okay. One of the first acts, you could call it the Navigation Act, you could call it the Navigation Law, it started in the 1650s. This is even before the end of the French and Indian War. It was very loosely enforced. It was supposed to restrict colonies with what they had to produce, and it also sort of started to establish sort of trade monopolies with England. So if you had certain goods, i.e. like tobacco, you were only allowed to trade that with England, so that England had a monopoly and could keep the price high. So in the 1750s, that's going to be loosely enforced, but after the French and Indian War, it's going to be more strictly enforced. And they're going to add to that, after the war, they're going to have what they call enumerated articles, which will be other items that are specifically allowed only to be traded with England, so that England can control these sort of like really high demand products and keep prices high, so that England itself benefits. So uh, these are going to anger the colonists. We're going to have more illegal trade and things like that, which is going to lead to other restrictive acts. Okay, like the Sugar Act. Okay, Sugar Act is going to raise taxes on sugar from the West Indies. It's essentially a tariff, so you can still buy sugar from the West Indies, but you're going to pay more for it, even though it's closer and was more available than if you get it anywhere else. Okay, we have the Quartering Act. We talked about this before. This is one of the things that's going to anger the colonists because now England is going to say, troops who are protecting you can now stay in your home and you provide lodging and food for them because they're protecting you. So you can see the British point of view here, but I think you can also see that the colonists would see this as a violation of their basic civil rights. And then, of course, one of the big ones is going to be the Stamp Act of 1765. Remember, anything that was legal, paper, a will or a marriage license or divorce license, or even things like newspapers, formal legal documents could have a stamp on, even like playing cards. So it kind of went nuts where the British were trying to raise money to pay for the debt of the French and Indian War. And so now paper products are essentially being taxed. Okay, so this is a big problem. All the colonists are pretty ticked off about this. It's not just localized to one area. So we have a colonial-wide protest, and we have really the first gathering where they're all on the same accord. We have the Stamp Act Congress. And it was meant to collectively deal with this Stamp Act. And you have a lot of results of this. Even before they repeal the Stamp Act, you have the formation of the Sons of Liberty, who are going to go out there and punish anybody who supports the Stamp Act, anybody who goes and enforces it, tar and feathering. I think Patrick Henry said something like, treat them, they will be dealt with accordingly. It's kind of a vague threat, but that's what he said. Then the Stamp Act Congress decides that one of the ways they can stop the Stamp Act is by having a non-importation agreements, which are essentially boycotts of British goods. And this has a very big effect, a couple effects. Even in England, they start to see the economic impact of the non-importation agreements. American colonists aren't buying their products. It's hurting the economy of British businesses too. So now British businesses are also calling for the repeal of the Stamp Act. We have the formation of the Daughters of Liberty, who are going to sort of promote these boycotts or non-importation agreements. And they're also going to have a secondary role where they start to develop some of the products that are now being boycotted in America from England. So we start to see their value to the Revolutionary War later on. Okay, remember saltpeter pins? Remember all that? Okay, yeah, I just said that. I just sang that on the lecture. So hope you enjoy that. Okay, so we know that in 1766, because of anger in England and of course in America, we have the repeal of the Stamp Act. Yay! No more Stamp Act. And then almost immediately the English pass what's known as the Declaratory Act, which allows Parliament to tax colonists in the same way, however they want, in any English possession, any English territory. Okay, so yay, we lost the Stamp Act. Boo, now we just open the door for Britain to tax us however they want to, and now it's legal. Okay, so other problems we talked about, we hear that cliche, no taxation without representation. That was the cry of the colonists and the Sons of Liberty, and England sort of counters that idea with the idea of virtual representation, because the English Parliament represents everyone across the realm, across the empire. Therefore, the colonists have actual representation, which the colonists really didn't buy. Okay, so we get into more oppressive acts. We get Charles Townshend. He was the Prime Minister of England. And he's going to want to raise money and pay for the debt, and even just raise money for the English crown. So we have what's known as the Townshend Duties or the Townshend Acts. This is 1770. In these acts, there were four of them. There was the Suspending Act. Remember, the Suspending Act suspended the New York legislature because the people of New York refused to abide by the Quartering Act. Then we had the Revenue Act, which was directly raised money for England. It wasn't for a specific purpose. The only purpose was to raise money directly for England. So it put taxes on things like tea, glass, paper, paint, lead, all those things. So just a really another annoyance with really no explanation to the colonists except we need to raise money. Okay, the Customs Act, that was number three, which really just added more hoops that businesses had to go through to export goods to other parts of the world. And then we had what's known as the Indemnity Act, which is sometimes called the Tea Act, which started to give preferential treatment to the East India Trading Company, which was the number one company that the British had their hands in. So we'll talk more about that one in just a second. Okay. When we get into the Sons of Liberty, Sam Adams is one of the big ones. He's going to write letters encouraging people to rebel. They called these letters that were sent around committees of correspondence. We, of course, have the Boston Tea Party, which is a reaction to the Tea Act, where the Sons of Liberty dress up like Native Americans and hoop and holler and throw over 300 chests of tea into the harbor, which is all because of the whole Tea Act, which is kind of silly because, as we said in class, the tea was more of a principle thing, a matter of principle. It wasn't a matter of the tea is expensive and we're having to pay extra. The tea was actually kind of cheap. Okay, so because of this act, Britain passes another set of laws called the Intolerable Acts, officially known as the Coercive Acts, and they were meant to punish Boston specifically. So we talked about these. The Boston Port Act, which is going to close the port of Boston until all that money that was lost in the Boston Tea Party is paid for. Okay, the Massachusetts Government Act, which is going to suspend the entire government of Massachusetts. It's now going to go back to becoming a royal charter where the government runs it, the English government runs it, the king runs it. They can't even have town hall meetings in Massachusetts. Okay, the Administration of Justice Act, which is if a British citizen, a loyalist, a British citizen, someone loyal to the crown, is accused of a crime, they don't stand trial here. They stand trial back in England. So George Washington calls this the Murder Act, in that British officials can essentially get away with murder because they're going to be tried not by a jury here in America, but by someone back in England who is not affiliated with the situation at all. Okay. The Second Quartering Act is also part of these coercive acts. And then finally, the Quebec Act, which is just, I don't want to say it. I really don't want to say it, but I'm going to say it. The straw that broke the camel's back. I'm not going to say that. I just said it, though. But essentially what that's going to do is it's going to give land back to French Catholics in Canada and expand their territory all the way to, I think, the Ohio River. So territory that was taken from the French after the French and Indian War, forbidden for exploration and exploitation to the colonists, is now going to be given back to the French. And that is going to anger more colonists. So all those things are going to lead to the first official meeting of the colonists to decide what to do. What are we going to do about independence? Are we going to declare? Are we going to send some sort of petition, final petition to the king? And that's going to lead us to the first Continental Congress. So we'll stop there and we'll resume with video 2 that'll cover the war itself and the signing of the Declaration.